it doesn't surprise me there are negative comments, and I think that's part of the melees of and maybe the near depression, or what goes into depression for pastors, is they're getting criticized a lot. Yeah. And if they have a tendency, like I've had in the past, is to be self-critical as well, man, you've got three strikes against you. You've got yourself criticizing you, your congregation or neighbors, congregants criticizing you, and then you certainly got the enemy, the devil criticizing you. And that's just too much for any one person to bear, and it'll take you down.
After the outpouring of responses to our Pastors and Suicide episode a few months ago, Gary Wilkerson answers some of the questions that viewers sent in about the nature of depression. He also addresses some misconceptions surrounding suicide, particularly in the church. Historically, some churches have viewed suicide as an unpardonable sin. In secular culture, suicide has been excused or even romanticized as a tragic but legitimate way to escape your troubles. Today, Gary offers a more biblical but also compassionate view of suicide. As he responds to viewer comments and questions, he also encourages believers with specific ways they can find healing for this kind of deep hopelessness. Now here's our host, Bob Dittmer.
Well, welcome to another Gary Wilkerson podcast, a special podcast today. We're doing it from Gary's home, and we're going to do a follow-up of a previous podcast where we talked about depression, suicide as a general topic, but more specifically pastors and suicide. And we brought this topic up a few weeks ago when several pastors were in the news for having committed suicide. And it got a lot of reaction from our viewers and our listeners, and many of them wrote in. In fact, it was one of the topics that got the most response on our social media sites. Some people asking questions, some people making comments about what you said, what we talked about. So we kind of wanted to go through a few of those and have you answer them, answer the questions and respond to some of the comments that were made, since it got such a great reaction from our viewers and listeners.
I'm curious, maybe you could help me with this one. Why do you think it got the most reaction? You would think, because most people aren't pastors. Yeah. You think if we were just talking about suicide in general, it might get a more response. I wonder if it's because of the fear, if my pastor would go there, how much more susceptible I might be. I don't know.
I think there's a possibility in that, and also in looking through the questions and the comments that came in, I think there is this feeling that a pastor shouldn't be dealing with this. A pastor should know the answers to these things, almost putting a pastor in a different category of human being. Mm-hmm. They've conquered this, as if pastors can conquer things that are in their lives. Yeah. And most of the comments were supportive of pastors. We need to pray for them, and we need those things to support them. But many of the comments were, especially the negative ones, was pastors shouldn't be dealing with this. Yeah. And it was, and we'll see in some of these questions, some of it was who's influencing the pastor more if they get to that point. Mm-hmm. Spiritually, who's influencing them more. So I guess maybe if I were to guess, it would be dissatisfaction with the thought that a pastor would deal with this. I mean, that's what I'm trying to aspire to from the typical writer. Why isn't he over this? Why isn't he able to conquer this? How can he advise me if he's having a problem with it? In very general terms.
Yeah. There might be some fear involved in particularly the negative responses. Just like, well, wait a minute, it's like, I get depressed, or wait a minute, that thought has crossed my mind before, and if a pastor can't overcome it, maybe I'm afraid it'll be too much for me. So that could be. But I just think maybe I would start, if you don't mind, Bob, with I don't know, this is a heavy topic and a big one, and one you think you might want somebody who has their PhD, and if there is such a thing as a doctorate in helping people through depression and suicide. I don't have that PhD or any particular expertise medically about this, but I've been a pastor for almost 40 years and do these pastors' conferences through World Challenge Ministry. I think we've been in 60 plus countries, and spoke to probably, well over 100,000 pastors. It might even be close to 200,000 pastors that we've spoken to and ministered to. And so I've fielded their questions. I've had lunches with them. I've had the times where all the key leaders of, at one table will be the head of the Baptist church, the Methodist church, the Episcopal church, the Pentecostal church, the Evangelical Alliance, and looks good, sounds good, and fun and friendly. But sometimes if you go for a walk with them or something like that, you start hearing their heart, and there's some difficulties there. There's some sense of, before I get into that, just so yeah, I think that maybe is at least minimally qualifies me to be able to speak a little bit to this issue, even though I'm not a therapist or a doctor. But having talked to all these guys and some of the women, when you get them alone, it's sometimes a different story, and you see, even if it doesn't go to the extreme of suicide, it oftentimes is a lot of a lack of self-care. Like they would remind me, a lot of pastors would remind me of a lifeguard who's not trained well, who jumps into the water, and a lifeguard will, a trained lifeguard, when they come to you, if the person is looking like they've lost not just the air, but they've lost control of their senses, and they're going to maybe take you down, they tell you to put your 2 feet out and hit them in the gut, take the wind out of them, and then you can pick them up and take them. So and basically you got to take care of yourself before you take care of anybody else. Pastors usually don't realize that. They feel like to be a good pastor means you take care of everybody else yourself, before yourself. I think that's why a lot of, when you think of a pastor's kids, that's not always a positive. You think of kids that's going to be struggling, alone, maybe rebellious, prodigal, drug addict. A lot of that comes from, again, you're caring for your congregation, you're caring for your city, you're caring for the vision, you're caring for what you feel is God's agenda, and sometimes that's more our agenda than His. And so we do more than we should, and we take on more responsibility than we should. We try to fix people's problems when it's not up for us to fix. We're just meant to offer ourselves and our love, and what wisdom He's put inside of us. We're just meant to offer it, and yet we're trying to fix it, and we feel responsible. And if somebody's not fixed right, we get full of self-doubt and criticism, like I should have fixed that. I know what that's like to be. I did a funeral for a 18-year-old boy, maybe 20, and for years we tried to help him out of his heroin addiction, and his mother would come to me for counseling, like she was coming to me to how I fix him, and I was coming to her, how do I fix her so she can fix him, and it's this quagmire, and finally I ended up doing his funeral, and he'd overdosed, and I remember the shame and the anger directed at myself, like I should. If I was a good pastor, this wouldn't have happened. So that, was there a question?
Yes, well, I think you're describing the situation perfectly of what pastors are facing.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of the comments that I brought up are somewhat negative, and so that's a good preface to the difficulty that pastors face, and then have you answer as some of these comments come in.
And even if you don't mind, Bob, before you go into the negative comments, it doesn't surprise me there are negative comments, and I think that's part of the melees of and maybe the near depression, or what goes into depression for pastors, is they're getting criticized a lot. And if they have a tendency, like I've had in the past, is to be self-critical as well, man, you've got 3 strikes against you. You've got yourself criticizing you, your congregation or neighbors, congregants criticizing you, and then you certainly got the enemy, the devil criticizing you. And that's just too much for any one person to bear, and it'll take you down. And so, but it doesn't surprise me that, I would say, in my years of pastoring, you've got 2 type of congregants. One are they understand you, and they know you're not the Messiah, and they just want you to walk alongside them, and maybe you're leading them by just being a little step ahead of them. Others almost demanding perfection, and when you fail, and I've made so many mistakes as pastors, and you kind of know in your congregation right from the get-go, okay, I just made a mistake, and here's probably 5 people I know I'll hear from probably within the next 24 hours, email or phone call, or I need to meet with you. And there were some people in my congregation, like whenever they said I need to meet with you, it was always something I had done wrong. And then there was the other kind, like, hey buddy, I know you're human, and it's okay, pat you on the back, and hold your arms up. It's like, what did Moses think when his arms went down? Oh, I'm such a failure. Look, I'm like, how many guys? I was curious, like, if they started losing when his hands were down, like, did that mean like some people got killed? I don't know, or wounded, or just did they run?
It was war.
It was war. So, he had to feel pretty bad about that. And then, but he needed somebody to bring his hands up, and so it's I'd love to talk about the negative ones, but I also want to encourage people to realize pastors are human. They're not gods. They're not mini gods. They're people, and they're just trying to be a step out to help bring us along, and they're not trying to. You can't demand more of them.
No.
And as a pastor, if a pastor's listening, you can't demand more of yourself. That'll ruin you. You may not commit suicide, but you're going to be miserable.
Well, my hope is that the pastors that are listening are probably hearing these comments, and they're curious as to how do you rationalize them with these things that I'm hearing with these comments are the same way. So I'm hoping that pastors won't feel beaten up over this. They're going to feel that you're giving them some reasons to overlook these things or a way to get through them.
And if a pastor has not been beaten up in a while, I can take a few minutes and
he will
accuse them right here now if they want. Like, you're terrible, you're rotten, your sermon was no good.
All the things they said to themselves already, right? Or the enemy did, I should say.
Or the emails they got.
That's right.
Why aren't you studying more? I thought you were spiritual.
Well, let's get to a few of these.
Yes, please.
First one comes from Quasi. A lot of these came from out of the country, interestingly enough. Nice. He says, it's the issue of spirituality and not of religion that should be considered in its entirety. They need to understand themselves spiritually. They need to open their hearts and receive more of God's love, something we'll be talking about soon. They need to love themselves first. Is it a case of a lack of spirituality if you have a pastor who's depressed and even to the extent then of suicide?
I like his comments because he's hitting on an aspect of spirituality that I think that brings to bear some truth on this particular issue. When he talks about loving yourself or the ability to have a self-compassion or care about yourself, I said that earlier, taking care of yourself. And so if you're defining spirituality not just as do you read your Bible every day and pray, to me, if that's his question, then he's putting demands on somebody like, if you do more of this, then you won't have problems. More rules, more regulations. That's religion. That's death, and it won't bring anybody to life or to a pastor who's suffering and hurting. But I think there's something good in what he's saying, and I hope that's where he was going with the question. Was if a pastor would, or anybody would take a moment and just learn to, I don't know, like we've talked on this podcast before about some of my children being addicted, and and one of the things they learned, and it was so sweet. I loved when they learned this. They called it the 3 Gs. It's kind of in a recovery mode, and it's 3 things. It's what you're grateful for. It's what you three things you're grateful for, and you list them every day. And so my kids would send me these three things, and it was so sweet that they took a moment in the midst of like, this is bad and this is rough and I'm suffering with this, but I'm grateful for. Sometimes they'd say, "I'm grateful for you, Dad," and man, that just warms your heart. And so I think there's an element in this truth that he's bringing out here, the saying like, if you're not so hard on yourself, and if you're not so self-critical, and if you don't listen to the voice of the liar, anything he says is you can pretty much count on the opposite. And the thing that you're suffering, the thing that you feel bad about, is probably your greatest strength as well. Bob, you and I have talked about that before. It's like if you're a man, a woman who, just in the core DNA of who you are, you're a lover of souls, a lover of God. There's a deep passion. There's just an exuberance inside of you and a craving and a longing to be deeply connected with people and love them well. Then probably the enemy's going to attack you in lust, the false intimacy. I don't feel like I'm adequate in my ability to love others, so I'll get it the easy way, pornography or masturbation. I'll get the easy way out of feeling connected to somebody and love, getting love on a computer screen, and so so you can beat yourself up. So I was with a pastor in Nashville this past week, and he has a ministry to pastors who are addicted to pornography, and he said there's a whole lot of them, but instead of the self-hatred, like I'm such a failure, I should quit, I should die, I should die, instead of saying like, the enemy's attacking not my weakness but my strength. There's something in me that is built for love, and I need healing and I need hope, and maybe I need a sabbatical to get counsel to get through this addiction. But if you get stuck in those things that you're really, it's your gift, but it's been corrupted. If you get stuck in that, then you get into that place of self-hatred, feeling like such a failure that you might as well just check out. It's like it's hopeless. Some pastors that I think are suicidal are. I've heard so many pastors say this. I don't know how to do anything else. My education. You don't get. You don't go to IBM or Apple and say like, I can tell you, I can name the books of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, or I can tell you, what's the difference between the third heaven and the first. That's not going to get you a job hardly anywhere. And so pastors are saying, this is all I've got. This is all I know how to do, and I do it pretty good, but I'm failing. Either internally I'm failing, or externally I'm failing. My church isn't growing, and there's this cultural craziness that says, I have to be a pastor of a big church or a growing church. And so I think I want to start something in our conferences now that like if you have a church like under 100 people or under 50 people, I want you to stand. And we just want to applaud you. It's like, well done you. That's the hardest job. If you have a church of 2,000, it's easy because you got a big staff and you got enough money to pay for the building and you can take a 3-week vacation. If you're pastoring a church of 100 people, well done you, because you're doing it pretty much. You're the janitor and you're everything else.
Yeah.
And so don't hate yourself and don't feel like a failure. You're not a failure. You're a success. Yeah. And I think that's what maybe this question is looking at, is you can be a success when you not having to do with the externals of how good is my ministry going, but I'm a success because I know who I am. I know who Christ sees me to be, and I enjoy that. I like being me. And if you can't like being me, then nothing else will work for you.
Yeah, good answer. Charles wrote in, and Charles said, the impact of American Christians resulting in depression was because of a reluctance and too much reliance on faith built upon the foundation of frequent Christian revivals and conferences. I think what he's saying is we have these revivals and conferences where you get all emotional and all excited, and then you get back to every day and depression sets in. Is there reality in that?
Good thought, Charles. Yeah. Was it Charles?
Charles, yes.
Yeah, good thought, Charles. I think that's a brilliant analysis of the situation, the ups and downs, and then needing the next revival to boost you up. I don't know, nothing wrong with revivals, and I've gone to conferences and meetings where I've gotten refreshed. I think that would be a good word, getting a boost. But if you're looking for that to be your source of life, it's not going to get you there. You've got to have. I think the spiritual disciplines are more important maybe than attending a revival meeting. That's your daily. I was telling our staff this morning at devotions, don't wake up and get your phone first thing and check emails and your Instagram and Facebook, because we tend to wake up. At night you're not conscious of stuff, so you're in your subconsciousness. There's so much stuff in our subconscious mind that is troubling to us, and so there's a tendency in a lot of people, not everybody. Some people wake up sort of, I want to kill them sometimes. they wake up happy, and I tend to wake up, and I think a lot of people I know tend to wake up a little bit more, kind of having to revive themselves a little bit. The Bible says David encouraged himself in the Lord. Well, if he encouraged himself in the Lord, he must have been discouraged to start with, or he wouldn't need to encourage himself. And so it's interesting that this great songwriter, this great poet, this great priest, this great king, this great warrior got discouraged and felt like, so if he was discouraged, what was he? I'm not doing it good enough. I'm not a good enough king. I'm not a good, that song was horrible. That shouldn't go in 150 chapters. Throw that one out. And so, but he had to encourage himself. So I recommend people wake up in the morning and encourage themselves, and that'll, then you won't tend to need the revival. It's almost like, Bob, I know you and I both like to exercise, and so, you don't go to, exercise camp every year and do 4 days.
I could use it, but
you could do that for like learn stuff but that's you would think be stuff integrated into your daily life.
Yeah.
And so I think the revivals are kind of like that. And my dad told me one time, he said, I never want to have to be revived again. And he said, I never want to have to go to an altar call again. An altar call, for those maybe who don't know, is like at the end of a sermon, and mostly in Pentecostal quarters. At the end of a thing, there'll be a response. Come forward, and we're going to pray for you. Yeah. And he said, I never want to go to an altar call again. I was like, why not? He goes, because I want to be, before the sermon starts, stay in a position of repentance and cleanness and heart before the Lord, and in not need to be revived in my passions for Jesus, like to be, don't need revival because I stay revived, and that can't happen through going to a revival. It has to be, you have to be a revived person, and that comes more, I think, through the spiritual disciplines. And when I say spiritual disciplines, I'm less concerned about, did you read your Bible every day, and how long did you read it? My dad read his Bible hours a day and prayed hours a day. My mom didn't. She hated reading. I would see her read her Bible maybe once a month. But she listened and she heard, and when she heard a sermon, she just absorbed it. And she was just as spiritual as my father. She had as much love and heart, and her prayers were cries out to Jesus, like that were so pure. And so there's not a...
There's no one way.
There's no one way, yeah, exactly. And so you be yourself and present yourself to the Lord as you are, and try to read, yes, try to pray, yes, but more so, it's a relationship, and
Scripture tells us His promises are new every morning, right? So every morning we ought to be reminding ourselves of that. Yeah, very good. Dolvi was a little bit more negative on a couple of his comments. It says he says it depends on who is being referred to in the Word of God. Why only in the Christian world is this depression being encountered? Do you think it is? We certainly do hear about it among pastors. We don't hear about it with Muslims. We don't hear about it those who are Buddhists.
Right.
Is this just where we are in the Christian world in the West? We kind of are self-reflective on these things?
I don't think the person that asked that question, nor myself or you, have the statistics on that to be able to have evidential statistical proof on that. So I think it's kind of hard to comment on that, and then maybe it's a supposition that why are Christian pastors like the anecdotally, I think I'd probably disagree with that and say I think Christians are less inclined. A true Christian is less inclined to commit suicide. It doesn't mean that they don't. There's, as we talked about in the original podcast about suicide, there are chemical situations, there are circumstantial situations, there are things, and sometimes you can say if that person would have gone this route, they might not have committed suicide. Other times, it's not like it's not something you want to fault them for, and so I wouldn't see it that way. I wouldn't see it as being that but let's suppose for a minute it was. Let's just say, okay, Christian leadership commits suicide more than other religious leaders commit suicide. Then I would say, what type of experience are they having? So again, meeting all these pastors, I've been around that table again with the bishops and the denominational leaders, and I've met pastors that I just know, and I don't mean to be judgmental or mean-spirited here, but you know what I'm talking about here. You just know they don't know God. Yeah. They know religion, and they know. I mean, there's this guy named Bishop Spong in New Jersey. Yeah. You know about him?
I do.
Yeah. I don't even think he believes in God, but he's a priest. Yeah. I mean, what's the deal with that? So I could see people being in such despair because when you're in such deception and missing out. I mean, obviously, to be a priest, you're longing for something spiritual, but to believe there's no God is pretty.
You're living a lie. I would think, aren't you?
Yeah, and so if it was ever proven to me that Christian leadership commit suicide more than other religious leaders, then I would say it's religious Christian in name only, the Christendom rather than the Christian, because I think that there is not every. Being a Christian doesn't absolve you from the possibility of and the temptation of suicide and depression that lead to it, but there is a great resource in knowing Christ. The Bible calls it a balm in Gilead. That means an oil that can heal you, and I think that's available. Sometimes that oil does not heal. Not because it's not sufficient. Everything from God is sufficient, but it's not received. Sometimes intentionally, anger, bitterness, unforgiveness. Other times, not intentionally. A chemical imbalance, a mental disability that blocks that ability of being healed. So the healing is available, and that person is like just not getting it. And the brain wiring and stuff like that can lead to to suicide. I don't have the statistics on it. Somebody told me one time, and I don't think this is scientific, but that 80% of suicides are depression-based and self-hatred and circumstantial. I got a diagnosis and I'm going to be in pain and I'm not going to be able to bear that. And so it's circumstantial. And 20% is biological, chemical, physical situations. And so, are you going to accuse either one of those people? And I'm not putting suicide in good light and say pat you on the back and oh, you're okay. It's a problem that has to be addressed, and we want, as the old spiritual writers and the Desert Fathers called it, the cure of souls. We want souls to be cured, whether it's physical or circumstantial, relational, internal issues that people are battling with. We don't want to wink at suicide and just say oh well, it's just it's another problem that some people have, but nor do we want to. I think in the history there used to be, and I might take some criticism for this, there used to be, at every funeral of somebody who committed suicide, the pastor had to walk on eggshells, is what he or she would say, because the consensus probably was that person really didn't know God, and they really weren't a Christian, they weren't really saved, so I can't preach them into heaven here at this funeral. I have to pretty much say. And I think I understand some of the dynamics there, because if you don't make it in that moment a warning, this is serious, and if you don't know God at this point, this is not good, and so you don't want to cover it up as if it's nothing. But I think things have changed a little bit, and people are seeing suicide as not a unpardonable sin. And so I think it used to be, you remember that? It used to be labeled as an unpardonable sin. And I
know many writers have, just recently, because of all of these incidents, have written about that. Is it indeed that an unpardonable sin? And I don't think there's anything scripturally that suggests that it is, but it was seen as a deterrent. And so if you're a pastor, as we've seen with the suggestion of suicide begets suicide, the study that came out recently of the 13 Reasons Why, the Netflix series.
I didn't see that.
It's a series about a girl who commits suicide, and she makes a cassette tape of all the things she's going through. The series is about all of those stories. It has resulted in many suicides of teenagers around the country because of this compassionate suicide issue that's come up.
The show has.
The show has.
So
the show in the book that it came from.
Watch that show, and then they feel some kind of an affinity.
They do. They connect with the character. They're going through the similar issues, and she committed suicide, and so it's easier then for them to. As we've seen here in Colorado Springs, it becomes a spate of suicides, because once it happens, it becomes easier for the next person to do it as well. So I can see why pastors would feel concerned about that, not making it appear to be something that's an option. Back to Dolvai, he makes another point, another paragraph that I'd like you to respond to. He said, pastors are unaware, these pastors who are depressed and those that commit suicide, are unaware that they're being possessed by Lucifer.
Wow.
Is that true? Do you think it's true that if you're in depression, it's because Satan is possessing you, influencing you?
I think that question is influenced by Satan more than those people. I think there's a corruption in that kind of judgment. That's the kind of stuff that Jesus hated, that you look at somebody else's suffering, the woman caught in sin, and you become a stone thrower, and so I don't like that kind of comment. Not try to accuse him of, anyway, I'm almost doing what I'm accusing him of doing to others, so I don't want to do that. I want to have grace and mercy, and maybe he's struggling with something that is from his background or history. But no, there's and I'm not going to contradict myself here, but I am going to say also, it doesn't mean that Lucifer, as an entity of evil and hatred and death, doesn't want to cause those things and doesn't have a role in this situation. But the question to me, the reason I don't like it so much is it sounds like there's an accusation there. If you're demon possessed, or you're filled with the devil, or you live for the devil, therefore you got what you want. You got what you deserved. And I'm sure he's probably not going into that extreme statement, but it's a lot of that. You don't see the humanity in that kind of question. I don't like the humanity is meant to be gracious and compassionate and hurt when somebody else is hurting. The opposite of true humanity, as God intended us to be, is the Pharisaical, religious judgment, harshness, anger, and
sounds like Job's friends more, doesn't it?
Job's friends, and it's
this is your fault. Yeah.
I don't know this guy, but I would imagine if he were to open up his heart to me and we could spend a couple hours together, and he wasn't defensive, and I would say he's probably hurting and I would say he probably has a wrong view of God. He sees God as a God who would, like somebody who's suffering, like, oh, you're just suffering because you have Lucifer in your heart. He gets that because that's how he thinks God is. He's just mirroring what his false image of God, and that's, God is love. God can judge, and God can have wrath, and will have wrath in the future as well. But that's not who he is. It's something he will bring forth from his character and nature. But his character, in his divine essence, is love, and so he loves these pastors, and he loves them up to the last second when he's trying to rescue them from this malady and from this sickness and from this pain that they're in.
The issues of depression and suicide are complex. If you or someone you love is wrestling with either one of these problems, please reach out for professional help. Know that you are not alone, and there's many who would love to help you and pray for you. Also, pray for your pastor. Many of those who lead our churches are under intense spiritual attack every day. Your prayers can make an incredible difference in their lives. Want to learn more about this topic of mental and spiritual health? Gary Wilkerson and Nikki Cruz will be speaking at the Arise Crusade in October. Arise is sponsored by Teen Challenge and is dedicated to encouraging believers with the gospel and reaching everyone with God's promise of healing. Find out more at arisecrusade.com, and please join us in California this fall. The Gary Wilkerson podcast is brought to you by World Challenge, sound design for this episode by Mike Hall-Smith. This episode was written by Rachel Schmitz. Our producer is Chris Wigington, with video production by Aaron Gale. We hope you tune in next week to the Gary Wilkerson podcast. Until then, do all you can to live a better life and make a better world through Jesus Christ.